Wednesday, March 18th, 2015. Our setting is the parlor of the Henry DeLand House, a house museum of the West Volusia Historical Society. My name is Hilda McCarta, a member of the Historical Society and a resident of Volusia County since 1995. It is my pleasure to introduce Lorna Jean Hagstrom, a longtime resident of West Volusia County, who will share memories of the area in early days and the role of her family in some of the history and events of those days. Good morning, Lorna Jean.
Good morning.
Will you begin by telling of your life in West Volusia, when it began, and other details?
I have been living here for most all of my life, well over 50 years. I was born in Orlando and grew up in Kissimmee, but came through DeLand many times as a child because my mother loved the beach. So the way to get to Daytona Beach from Kissimmee, of course, was to come up 1792, and in those days there was no interstate, so all of the highways went right through town, and of course it passed right by Stetson University, so that was one of my earliest memories of DeLand, was going by the campus with all the brick buildings and the lovely oak trees and so forth. And then as a student at Florida Southern College, I had met my husband-to-be, who was also a student there. And so I decided to come up to Stetson for summer school one summer while I was in college, and lived on campus at Shadowan Hall. And then because I was an English major planning to teach, I did my intern teaching at DeLand High School before I graduated, so I was living here then. And then I had graduated from college in 3 years and got married 6 days later, and have been here ever since. So.
You told me about your career earlier in your life. How did that fit into your life and that of your family in DeLand?
Right after I got married, and I started teaching. It was DeLand Junior High in those days. There was no middle school. It was junior high, 7th, 8th, and 9th. Ed Talton was my principal, and it was brand new. They had just decided to separate the junior high and the senior high. The high school had been located on the corner of North Clara and West Rich, and the school board had realized they needed to build a new high school building because this one was, the student population was outgrowing the size of the building. But the problem was, that was my first year of teaching, it wasn't finished in time. So the junior high and the senior high had to go on double session at the old high school. The high school went in the morning and the junior high went in the afternoon. And we did that until after the Christmas holidays, when finally the new building was ready and the students could move in. I had gone to school on a Florida teacher scholarship, and this was back in the 50s when Florida was growing so fast and the school populations were growing and there was a terrific shortage of teachers. So the Florida legislature passed a bill which allowed scholarships for anybody who wanted to become a teacher. And the way you paid it back was to teach a year for every year that you used the scholarship. If you didn't teach, you had to pay back the money. Well, since I had graduated in 3 years, I had to teach for at least 3 years in order to pay it back. And then when I started my family, I stopped working. But then when they got old enough and the last one had started to school, I started working for the Orlando Sentinel and later for the Daytona Beach News Journal. I didn't do hard news. I did features, I did a column, I did business reviews, and that type of thing. And then later on, I became involved in the family fern business.
What are some of the things you recall about this area when you first arrived that might be different?
There were orange groves everywhere. The DeLand city limits was still basically the 4 square miles, bounded by Beersford on the south, boundary on the west, Plymouth on the north, and Hill Avenue on the east. And as soon as you left the city, there were some orange groves inside those city limits, very few, but as soon as you left the city limits, there were orange groves on both sides of the road, no matter which direction you went. And there were a lot of unpaved roads too. Kepler Road was not paved. Beersford was not paved from Boston to Blue Lake. Blue Lake Avenue wasn't paved. Hill Avenue was not paved. And when we built our house on South Hill, it was nothing but a 2-rutted dirt road. And after a while, with all the trucks going back and forth to the house, carrying all those heavy building materials, it kept making the ruts deeper and deeper. And of course, my car wasn't very high off the road, so pretty soon I couldn't even get to my house because it drug, the bottom of the car drug on the road. And I didn't know what I was going to do. And somebody said, well, what you do is you call your county commissioner. Because in those days, remember, there was no charter government, there was no county council. They had the old-fashioned county commission system. And so I called my county commissioner, and next thing you know, it happened to be Dean Smith. There was a road grader and a road scraper and truckload after truckload of dump trucks with clay, and they graded the road so I could get to my house. Another thing, of course, was the downtown area. There were no shopping centers, no malls, no big box stores. Everybody went downtown to do their shopping. And in the summertime, when all the winter visitors were gone and people were on vacation, the merchants closed in the summer every Wednesday afternoon. But there were, it was just wonderful, so many family-owned businesses. Mary Dyke's Children's Shop, Gibbs Women's Wear, Betty Drika's was a women's shop, DeHoy Jewelers, Reeve and Howard, which was where everybody went when you got married to register your china and crystal. Crease's Sporting Goods, Golf Ace Hardware. The only one that's still there is the Ace Hardware, not owned by Mr. Golf anymore, of course. But so many of those old family businesses are gone, and it's really sad because you got such great service because everybody knew everybody. In fact, it was so convenient because remember in those days there were no credit cards, and so the merchants, you had a charge account there. And I can remember my son used to ride his bike to school, and when he would tell me, Mom, I need socks or I need something for school, I'd just say, well, go to so-and-so and have them put it on my charge account, and that's what they would do. So let's see. Also, I remember that in those days there was no air conditioning. No, the schools weren't air conditioned, the churches weren't air conditioned, and in church, all the funeral homes, as part of their advertisement, they put cardboard fans in all the pews, and you'd sit there on Sunday morning fanning in the summertime because it was so, it wasn't just the heat, it was the humidity too. It was terribly hot. And women, even in that kind of weather, they still thought they had to wear hose and hats and gloves and the whole business. But so thank goodness for air conditioning. And even the women's organizations, the Women's Club was very active, the Garden Club, the Junior Service League, and the women would all wear their hats and gloves and so forth to meetings. Or if they had teas, they would wear them, so people dressed a lot more formally in those days.
Well, you mentioned your children. How many, and do they still live in the county?
I have 2 children, 7 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild. And fortunately for me, yes, they do all live in this area. In fact, the Hagstroms first came to West Volusia in 1884, so they are one of the pioneer families. They were Swedes, and they had come from Sweden to Pennsylvania, and there was a Swedish minister there, Reverend Chenel, and he had come down here and was very impressed with this area, and so he went back and he had bought up a lot of property and started selling it to the Swedes in his congregation in Pennsylvania. And the Hagstroms were one of the families. They bought 10 acres and came down with the idea to plant orange groves. That's what everybody was going to do, was to be orange growers. And the way they came in those days, you went to Jacksonville, got on a steamboat, and came down the St. Johns River to Astor. And then from Astor, they had to walk over to Pierson, which was about 5 miles. And the family story goes that my children's great-grandfather, who was 2 years old at the time, was Album. It was in the summertime, and he kept complaining about having to walk in the hot ashes because that white sand, anybody who's ever lived in Florida knows how hot sand can get in the summertime. And to him, it looked just like the ashes in the fireplace. He had never seen sand before. But anyway, they built a house in 1885, which is still standing today. 4 generations of Hagstroms have lived there, and it's still owned by a member of the family. When Gustav and Marie Hagstrom, the original settlers, came, they came with 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. 3 more children were born after they got here. But their second oldest daughter, Leggett, was a companion to Fanny Burlingame, who was responsible for bringing Lu Gim Gong to this area. So they knew each other very well. And in fact, Lu Gim Gong decided that he wanted to marry her, and he knew that you had to go ask a woman's father for permission to marry her. So he got on the train from DeLand and rode up to Pierson, and of course Gustav Hagstrom said absolutely not. His daughter could not marry a Chinaman because there was a lot of discrimination in those days against the Chinese. In fact, even the other grove owners felt the same way. I don't know if it was because he was Chinese or because they resented his success because he was so well known for all he had done for the citrus business. But in those days, black laborers picked the oranges, and they had passed the word that if any of the black laborers picked Lu Gim Gong's oranges, they would be out of work, they would be out of a job. Well, he didn't know what he was going to do, so he happened to employ a black couple. Marie Hagstrom's brother, Carl Turnquist, was one of the other settlers who had come, and he worked at Stetson. He was their head carpenter. So what they did, they didn't want to arouse suspicion, so they got eggs from Lu Gim Gong's chickens and came into Stetson like they were going to sell him the eggs and told him what was going on. And he went back to Pierson, and all of the Hagstrom men came down and picked all of Lu Gim Gong's oranges. So they got to market. But something else the Swedes used to do in Pierson every year, the Lutheran church, of course, was the main church, and they put on a big smorgasbord every year. And of course, the women, they were Swedes, and they knew the traditional dishes, and the smorgasbord is a huge, mammoth affair, and they would do this every year. People would come from all over Central Florida to go to the smorgasbord. So that was another Swedish tradition that sort of died out, but it was nice in those days. I had been many times.
Well, jumping to another area, this is known as the area of hurricanes, Florida is. Are there any natural disasters that you recall that affected this area and your family in particular?
Well, in addition to the hurricanes, you're right about that, are the freezes. And of course, the most famous freeze was the freeze of 1894-95. And of course, I wasn't living then, but it did drastically affect the Hagstrom family because everybody's orange grove froze. In fact, the Hagstrom Grove froze all except for one tree, and that was the tree that happened to be right beside the house. I guess the heat from the house probably helped save it. But when they decided to replant the grove, they got all of the cuttings from that one tree, and that tree stood for over 100 years. I think it's gone now, but it was there for a long time. But the freeze of 94-95 was the reason that fern business got started in West Volusia. Peter Pierson, who his family, the town was named after, had a relative in Connecticut that was growing asparagus plumosus in a hothouse, and so he decided he would ship some down here because this was a moderate climate. He wouldn't need to be grown in a hothouse. And so he shipped some asparagus plumosus down, and the Piersons planted it, and it did fine. He had to move it several times to find the right growing conditions, but of course it had to be grown under shade. So originally they grew it under oak trees, under oak hammock. And then they started growing it in slat houses, and there was no polyurethane in those days, but they would cut cypress boards and put them on the side of the fernery and the top of the fernery. They'd put a board, a space, a board, a space, a board, a space, top and the sides, and that way there would be filtered sun all day long. So it wasn't ever in direct sun, but it wasn't completely shaded. Of And then in the 60s is when the leather leaf became popular and polyurethane came in. And back in those days, the grove owners and the fern growers, in order to protect their property from the freezes, they used stoves, heaters, and there were kerosene heaters, and they placed them every so often in the groves and in the ferneries. And if you had a bad freeze, when you had several nights of below freezing temperatures, the next morning you'd get up and there was smoke everywhere. It was hard to breathe. But nowadays, of course, they use water and it's much cleaner. But we also had a famous freeze of 57, 58, which I remember because it killed the orange groves all over Florida, even as far down south as Miami. And we had the freeze of 62, 63, and I think that probably affected the freeze affected this area more than anything else, because it really sort of helped move the citrus business away, and the fern business has still been very popular in the Pierson area. Now, in addition to just asparagus plumoses and leatherleaf, they grow other varieties of fern too to ship. And as far as the hurricanes go, I would say the worst hurricane in my memory is Donna in 1960. It had come in in through South Florida, and it had gone out into the Gulf of Mexico, and we thought, oh boy, we're finished with that one. And she took a U-turn and came right across central Florida. In fact, the eye of the hurricane passed over Volusia County, and that really was the high water mark in Volusia County. I don't think even as many hurricanes as we've had since then, we've ever had water as high as it was after Hurricane Donna. So.
Interesting. You mentioned air conditioning coming in your lifetime. What other inventions do you remember from your younger days or throughout your life that have made an impact?
Well, I guess the big technological breakthrough when I was in high school was transistor radios, because until that time, radios had to be large to accommodate the radio tubes and so forth, and then suddenly they could be powered with a transistor, and everybody could walk around with this little tiny radio and listen to it. So that was a big breakthrough. And I guess the other one that I remember after I came here, when we first moved here, party lines were very common. You could have 2, 3 houses on one phone line. You could pick up the phone to use it and somebody else would be talking, and you'd have to wait. But another thing that came along eventually was push-button phones, because prior to that, it was all dial, and if you had to dial a number that had a lot of 7s, 8s, and 9s, it would take forever because you'd have to wait till the dial went all the way back, then you'd do the next one, and push-button phones were so much faster. So.
Can you tell of a memorable experience that you or your family had?
Well, no one real thing stands out. I think the best thing that happened was coming to DeLand, and the fact that everybody still lives here. What's wonderful is that because my children, grandchildren were here, I could, we celebrate all the holidays together. I get to go to all their school programs, watch them at their football, all their baseball games, basketball, whatever. And so I get to be a very big part of their life, and my family's most important to me. I was just going to say, yes, I think education is probably the most important thing for anyone. My children and grandchildren are still all involved in the family fern business, but they still thought it was important to get an education. So I would say that probably is the best advice. But another thing I really love about this area is it's not a transient area. People come here and they stay for generations. And my children are friends, and my grandchildren are friends with people who have been families that have been our friends. That the friendship goes back generations. I don't know how else to say it. And I just think that's really special.
It is.
So.
Thank you.
Mm.
I see that. Is there anything else you'd like to recall?
No, I just think coming to DeLand was probably the best thing that ever happened.
Well, you have certainly been an asset to this community.
Well, thank you.
And I thank you so much for sharing your time and sharing your memories and experiences in West Volusia.
Thank you.
Lorna
It's been
Jean.
my pleasure.